Thank you for coming. We appreciate you coming on such short notice. Today we're here to talk about redistricting. I think that many of us probably have not been through this procedure, and so it's going to be a new experience for us. I'm Susan Moore, General Counsel of GMA, and if we could real quickly just go through the room and have everybody say who they are so that Linda has an idea of your jurisdiction. Jeff, if we could start with you.
Jeff Thompson, LaGrange.
Jim Elliott, Warner Robins.
Cynthia Daly, I should represent a county in 2 cities, will be Blacksburg, Temple, and Carroll County.
Lauren Meadows,
Rick Lindsay from Chattahoochee Hills, down South Fulton.
Susan Littlefield, Douglasville.
Terry Garman, Jackson, Locust Grove, Stockbridge, and Hampton.
Wayne Bryant, in-house counsel, Augusta Richmond County, Consolidated.
I'm David Strickland, Oxford, Butte County Water and Sewer Authority, and then I'm municipal.
Good. We're glad you could be here. I'm very quickly going to talk a little bit about the state law, which I think you're all painfully aware of, and then introduce Linda so that she can talk to you about the actual process of redistricting and what the kind of things that she's an expert on. As you're all probably aware, there is a state law that allows home rule authority to redistrict after the decennial census. But what we have is a window of opportunity to redistrict under that home rule authority. It's from the time that the census numbers become available until our first regular general municipal election following the release of those numbers. So we have a window of opportunity to do it. The problem is the time that it takes to get the data, to massage it, to draw your districts, and then to adopt an amendment to your charter which changes your districts, then get it sent to justice, pre-cleared in time for qualifying. That's really the difficulty that we're operating under right now. Because to amend your charter in accordance with the state law, of course, you're going to have to adopt your redistricting ordinance twice at 2 consecutive regular meetings, not called meetings, and you're going to have to advertise for 3 weeks prior to the final adoption of the plan. Once that plan is adopted, then of course you have to send it to the Department of Justice to get it pre-cleared under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and Justice has a minimum of 60 days that they can take to look at your plan and approve it. It's very likely, if they don't get to it, that they will send a request for additional information and take another 60 days, which then puts you beyond qualifying and is going to create problems. Qualifying this year starts August 29th, is the beginning of the qualifying period, which is either between 3 and 5 days and starts August 29th. So that's the rush that we're in to try to get this done in a timely fashion. I took a look in our files to see what had been done in previous years because of this, and I found a series of letters and memos where people were just panicked. I saw, look, in 1981, oh, we're all panicked. Oh, my God, we have to get this done. Oh, look, 1991. So apparently we're on course for being slightly panicked about this. But what we wanted to do is take this opportunity to bring Linda in and have her talk to you about redistricting. She was the director of the Legislative Office of Reapportionment for redistrictings, which is some substantial experience when you're talking about doing it for the legislative districts for the entire state of Georgia as well as our congressional districts. So that's a lot of experience. And she's going to talk to you about how to actually do the redistricting, the federal principles you need to bear in mind, how to get the data, and things like that. And she's also going to answer your questions. So please don't be shy. If you have questions, please ask. I also want to let you know that we are taking notes during this process and preparing an FAQ based on the questions we've received from attorneys, and we're going to be posting that on our website as we get additional questions and additional answers, and we're going to continue to post information so that you can see it as we get it. And we will be posting the PowerPoint as well. So if there are people from your jurisdiction who you would like to see this material, it will be available. So without further ado, Linda.
Thank you, Susan. First of all, I want you to take a look at this map and kind of see any oddities. We may have a question about it at the very end, and those that can answer it can leave the room early. Otherwise, you cannot leave the room unless you ask a question. Okay. as Susan has said about the redistricting, about cities being able to do themselves, the beginning point, of course, is the fact that the 2000 census data was released the last week of March here in Georgia, and it is called the PL 94-171 data. And I'm telling you that because it is the official redistricting database. And it is the only game in town. This is the database that the Justice Department recognizes as the numbers that they use to analyze your plans, etc. There's other folks that talk about doing their own census, or because they have some additional information that they think is better, they want to adjust the numbers and add that in. Basically, that's just a complication. You've got to live with the census data. And later on, I think there's going to be somebody who's going to ask me about, well, what if we don't like our numbers and we're going to challenge them? The challenges to the census numbers are called the Count Resolution Program. It doesn't even begin until June, and it's going to take a while. For those cities that are challenging, you need to have some specific ideas about what's wrong with your count. You can't just say, oh, I know we've got more people than this and this is wrong and I want you to come back. They're not going to do that. You've got to say, we think that in this area you counted some people in the county that are actually in the city, and show that. Or you're going to say, you know, you took this apartment complex that has 600, 700, 800, 900 people and you placed it outside, or something, or that you've moved something. So the more specific you can be in those challenges. And I suggested this morning that you might want to call the Regional Census Bureau here in Atlanta about any kind of guidelines that they may need or can offer you about how do you challenge these numbers and what kind of information. But I don't think a general idea of we don't think our numbers are right is going to quite get it. But also on that subject, while I'm thinking about it, when you do question the census, and some things they may find on their own in reviews and just send to you without your questioning. They're going to send you that data. In the past, you got that data and just said, we have added 1,216 people to your city. And that's what they told you. That was it. They didn't tell you what census block or anything else. This is the first time that they're actually, if they make a correction, going to take that population and assign it to a specific census block. However, that is only the total numbers. They will not give us any racial characteristics for that block. So unless local knowledge can give an idea about, you know, what those characteristics are, that's going to be a guess or an estimate or whatever. So that presents us another little wrinkle in the redistricting as far as the numbers and the race numbers and all that we have to submit under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Are you saying if you challenge and you get additional, or even if they come up with additional, it's the additional that won't have that type of information? Or?
Any what they call count resolution, which is a nice word that sounds good on their part, for a census number count correction, is what we would probably be more normal, will only be the total number attributed to a census block. It will not have any of the racial characteristics attached, regardless of whether we point it out to them or they find it or whatever. It's only going to be a total number.
Excuse me, is that available on a website that you're aware of?
The what now?
Public law 194.
The data?
Mm-hmm.
Becky, the fact that they're going to get out to you, we've done some research in order to be able to, it's available, yes, to answer your question. It is on the web. It is a little difficult going into how to find it and get it down to the level of detail that you need.
Right.
We've been doing some research to put that together for you and along with the census maps, and so they're going to distribute that along with that fact sheet when they send that out in the next few days.
Okay.
In fact, we got some late information over the weekend. We're trying to find an easier way for you to access it. It's awkward at this point if you're not a real expert at maneuvering through the census website. Am I doing this wrong? Here we go. Okay, Susan said the cities had that power to redistrict themselves for this short period of time. This is something that only the cities have. County commissions can't do it. School boards haven't been able to do it. ACCG's lobbied every decade since you got the power to be able to have that power, but it's only the cities. And when you understand the background, you'll probably understand why. That the in 1981, this law was drafted and introduced by Representative Grace Hamilton from the city of Atlanta. And about every other census, Atlanta's elections fall the same year as we got the census. At that time, as it is now, the continuing policy was that the legislature was not going to take up local legislation until after the special session, and it would be the next regular session, which in this case would be 2012, which was too late to help the cities. So it was a statewide law that applied statewide, and probably that first year, the city of Atlanta was probably the only one that really utilized it to their benefit. The problem was, from our standpoint today, that when it was passed, there was a very small number of cities that had districts. That was right the year or two before all the Section 2 lawsuits were filed all over Georgia against every county commission and city that had any kind of minority population concentration. But at that time, much of the work was done, even though the Legislative Redistricting Office was computerized. It was computerized to the point of whatever the state of the art of the computers was at that time, which meant we used the computers as a calculator for the census blocks. But all the maps were hand-drawn on paper maps from the Census Bureau. So it was a much simpler process, and when you just had a small city, you could get a list of data from us. It had every census block listed with the population and race, and a map, and cities could, in fact, have the ability to do it themselves. Now, things have gotten much more complicated. The census data is a lot more complicated, and it is much more difficult to do this by hand. You just about have to have some kind of computer capability and GIS software, and preferably some GIS software that has some redistricting capability already built in. To catch you up, so there, yes, sir?
I just have to ask about consolidated governments. Justice Richmond County, Columbus, and Athens. Do you know whether or not they will be treated as cities or counties?
I think for purposes of redistricting, my impression is, I know for Athens Clark County, for example, that they're treated as county for this purposes, and that we do those for the next election, because your elections aren't held in an odd year, are they? When's your next election in Augusta? 2012?
I don't know why I was under the impression it was this year. No, it was last year, so 2012.
Yeah. So they're treated for purposes of redistricting as a county would be.
So they will be prohibited.
Yeah, they cannot do themselves. The in 1971, 81, 91, the policy at the Capitol was that the Legislative Redistricting Office did not assist the cities and counties until after the legislative and congressional districts were completed in the special session. So in that fall was when the intensive work began on the cities and counties, particularly county commission and school board. In 2000, and this is what probably has caused some confusion among a lot of the cities, the redistricting process was a little bit different, and I hired a large staff, and they were well-trained, smart young folks, expecting this to be inundated with folks wanting to draw plans. But that process was a little bit different. There was a lot of plans being drawn someplace else. So I had this great, fantastic staff that was willing to go to work, and I thought, I'm not wasting this talent. So I just turned them loose on local, and everybody that made an appointment could come up and get it. And then I talked with the speaker, and I said, we've got to include local legislation in the call for the special session so we can pass as much as we can. And that's what we did, and a lot of cities were able to take advantage of that, and we started very early so we could get them done and the plans to them in time for the city elections. Well, this time they've changed things. The staff is much smaller. It's about the same size as what I had during a normal year that was not redistricting, so that staff is not available to you. With all that said, let's talk about redistricting. What's required and what you need to get started. Let's talk about, first of all, the legal requirements. There are 2 legal requirements for redistricting. The first one and the oldest one is 1 person, 1 vote. And that's an old, long-standing law that came out of the Constitutional Convention of the compromise between large states and small states, where it said the large states wanted more representation. The small states were afraid they were going to be inundated, so they came up with a compromise at the Congress, the House of Representatives was going to be based on population. The Senate would be 2 senators per state regardless of size. So that was written into the Constitution. So the only legal reason for holding a census every 10 years is for redistricting. And after a whole series of laws and whatever into the early 60s, it finally got down to 1 person, 1 vote, and it got applied all the way down to the local level over those period of years during case law. Now, you're going to hear a lot of the jargon. I want you all to be familiar with it because as you deal with it, you have to know. The first thing is, well, 1 person, 1 vote, ideal district size. What is that? Well, you take the total new population of your jurisdiction and you divide it by the number of districts that you have. So if your city council has 4 districts and you have 20,000 people, you take that 20,000 people and divide it by 4 and you get 5,000. So that is your ideal district size. The state House takes this new state total and they divide it by 180 because we have 180 House districts and that's their ideal district size. So it's just the total population of the jurisdiction divided by the number of districts that you have.
That is total, not voting age or anything.
No, it's based on total. Names and arms, everything. So it's the total population for this. Because one of the reasons that you could argue would be that people would say, well, during a decade, because these numbers last 10 years, a lot of the folks that are children now grow into voter age population at that time, and you have people come and go. So it's total population. Then you can ask, well, if that's the ideal district size, can we vary from that? Can we deviate from that ideal district size? Well, case laws has said that for congressional districts, they have to be as close to 0 as it is practicable to achieve. But also think about how big a congressional district is. So if you take 500 people out of a congressional district, could be 0.01 deviation, for example, of how big it is. So it's very important for congressional, and congressional are based on the whole nation, and they want every congressman to be as close to the same number of people representing as possible. So they really hold fast to that 0 deviation. However, for legislative districts and local redistricting, that allow us a little bit more leeway. One of the reasons is that the smaller the jurisdiction is, the smaller the number for the ideal, that a census block or various sizes, there could be some way that no matter which way you shifted a line, that there was no census block available to you that would hit right at 0. So they know that you have to be flexible, and they've allowed that. So that what they say on this one is that districts could vary a plus or minus 5 or an overall 10%. Okay, so that means in this case that the largest district should be no more than 5% more than that ideal district size. The smallest district should be no shorter than minus or an overall 10. Now, there can be exceptions to that in that overall 10 is what they're looking at. So let's say that you were drawing a district and there was one boundary that was just a perfect boundary because everybody in the city understands that where this creek is or this major highway or road or whatever, that that's a good boundary. And in order to get to 0, you've got to cut across it and pick up 3 blocks, only 3 blocks of the subdivision or something. And so you went, in that instance, to a plus 6. But your smaller district was only a minus 4. You'd still have that 10% overall. But in most instances, it's pretty easy that once you, with the block level data, to keep within those 5% and meet most of your guidelines. But if you vary, the Justice Department's not going to be looking at your 1 person, 1 vote. If it's within that 10%, they just assume that it's okay. But it's where you could be challenged by somebody else that just doesn't quite like what you did on a plan, or looking for a reason to get it set aside because some other plan, if it gets redrawn, they think the line might move, they might be better able to run or have a better chance, or somebody that just likes to challenge things. If you go over that 10%, the burden's on you to prove that it still meets those guidelines, and that where you varied, you had a good reason. You kept incumbents intact, maybe, although they say that's not really a good legal reason, but or you kept to this major boundary that was understood by everybody, etc., didn't split a subdivision, but you have to have some good reasons, but the burden's on you. If it's less than 10%, the burden's on that person that's challenging you to prove to the court that for some reason it's not fair.
What's the standard on the burden?
I'm not sure what you're asking me.
You said the burden was on the city, so what's the standard?
I feel certain that it's preponderance of the evidence. Yeah, I don't know of any reason it would be anything greater than that.
Yeah, I agree with Susan's.
So then, can I understand, 5% from district to district, but the sum total of all the standard deviations
Being 10.
is not to exceed 10.
And we're going to go over a stat sheet in a few minutes, and we'll go over this again. This is okay. The second legal requirement is that a plan cannot violate the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And that's primarily made up for our purposes today of two sections. And Section 2 says that a plan may not have the purpose nor the effect of diluting minority representation. This can get complicated. You know, there's a lot of case law, but let's break it down to its easiest way to explain. First of all, and a lot of this goes back to a lot of the first times when we were creating these single-member districts. We went from at-large to districts, and we had a lot of rules. Now the pattern is kind of set, and this is a little easier to meet than it was in the beginning. But it would really be, I think, important to any city that is still going from single to, from at-large to single. We just don't have very many cities left in Georgia that have any kind of sizable concentration of minority population that are not in districts. But it was meant to be, for example, that you couldn't take all of the population. Let's say that you had a heavy minority population, but you took it in one district and made that district 80, 85, 90%. And on the district that bordered it, you had a district that was only 40%. Well, the Justice Department would look at that 85, 90%, and they said, whoa, whoa, you know, that's packing. You don't need that type of concentration of minority population to have a strong minority district where the minorities can have a candidate of their choice. You could have taken 20% of that minority population and moved it to this district and to 60%, and then you would have had a 60-65 and a 60-65 or 70 and a 60, but something that was that. So that would have been called packing. The other thing they looked at would be something where you took that district that had been 85, 90%, and you took part of them, you put them in this district. You left part of them in this district, and then you moved the rest of them to a third district. So you had 4 districts of maybe 40%, or 3 districts of 40%. Well, that was called cracking. So they were talking about packing districts or cracking districts. Those would have been violations of Section 2, where there was a minority concentration sufficient to support 2 districts or 3 districts, and it was very easily, the districts were compact that you could have done that without having to draw anything that was gerrymandered or unusual with them.
Linda, do you remember what is the percentage for a safe minority district, and whether that's voting age or population as a whole?
That has changed. For the longest time, and Georgia was one of the states that helped redefine that this last redistricting cycle. For the longest time, they considered 65% total population the magic number, with a 60% black voter age population, the magic number. And that came from the very early days of going to redistricting, where they thought that, first of all, blacks were not registered at the same rate as whites, so that you needed a heavier total number. Secondly, that if they were registered, they didn't always participate at the same rate as whites, so you needed a higher voter age population. And thirdly, that the minority community usually had more children under 18 than the white community, and so that you had to allow for that. So they came up with this idea of 65% total and 60% black voter age population as being a viable minority district. Well, that's changed over the years. First of all, the whole business about more children or not, that's pretty much not as much the case as it ever has been. But in many of our communities now, African Americans register and vote at a higher percentage rate than their white neighbors do. They also, we showed a lot of data when they did the House and Senate plan last time, when we took the numbers down, that we have better election data that shows this, but that they showed in many, many instances where blacks were getting elected in districts that were much less than the 65%. So they have really kind of backed off of that, and it's going to probably depend on the jurisdiction. There's an expression or that Justice Department has always been fond of using, and that was the totality of the circumstances. You'll see that in case law and whatever, and that they say they look at everything, so that, and that kind of protects them, because if they give you a hard, fast rule and you meet that but they still don't like it, they had to have a way to say, well, yeah, you did that, and you met the letter but not the spirit. So they came up with a totality, so they would look at a lot of different things. Well, they're looking at that now, and they've kind of come off of that 65% rule, and they're going to look at that, but it's not the magic number that it used to be.
Well, how about if your current safe seat meets the old threshold? I guess from a retrogression standpoint, that becomes the standard, or does it?
You're saying that the seat that's in effect now is 65%?
It was 65 when it was passed in 98. Is that going to be Justice's standard if, for whatever reason, the population shift makes that map look more like a 61?
That 61 is probably going to be okay, particularly if you have an African American or a minority incumbent in the district now that has gotten elected with those numbers.
Particularly if they're supporting the district map. Okay.
When you say the benchmark, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we get to the stat sheet and whatever, I'm probably getting ahead of myself, but you've got the existing plan, which is the benchmark plan, the one that's in effect now, and you have two sets of numbers for that plan. You have the numbers as it was passed after the 2000 census, and now you're going to have the numbers for that plan as it exists under the 2010 census. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The second legal requirement is Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which says that any change in voting policy has to be submitted to the Justice Department for its preclearance under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, most of you city attorneys are used to that in that you have to submit annexations. If a councilman resigned or whatever and you had to have a special election, you have to submit that. And it's pretty much pro forma for you. But, okay, on this one, on preclearance, they're looking when they get this plan up, and this goes to what he was saying about whether a plan retrogresses. They're going to look at it to see if when it started it had 3 nice districts, 3 strong minority districts. Does the new plan have 3 strong minority districts? And if not, why not? In some instances, it could be that you had 3 strong ones, but that one district was 25–30% short because of shifts in population or because of growth of annexation around the edges of the city. Can you make that one up? But in so doing, you had to take some of the black population from another district, and it brought it down to maybe 61. But if it's 3 viable districts, then you've still met that retrogression. So you're trying to maintain what you have going into the plan and into the changes. That's what they're going to look at, and if not, why not? So it's not saying that you have to. There just could be that the changes in the population make it impossible. That if you've gone from an ideal district size of 3,500 up to 5,600, and the population inside with the minority has been pretty stable, and that population growth is attributed to new areas that you have annexed around that are white suburbs or something, well then you have to say, okay, this is the shifts I made and this is the best I can do balancing that. But you have to be able to explain that because they're going to be looking at, did you move backwards in the number? And sometimes just because of the differences of population, it's not going to be possible to maintain them exactly, but it has to be effort made to do so. Preclearance is a major part. We talk about these 2 legal requirements, but this has gotten to be one of the biggest parts of the submission. And as I was saying a while ago, you as city attorneys are used to making the submissions for annexations, a special election, or whatever, and you do the submission, you send it up there, and for the most part within 60 days you get a reply back, and it's usually not a problem. It becomes a major part of your strategy for redistricting, and let me explain to you why. every jurisdiction in the country that is under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is doing what we're doing and talking about what we're doing, and it all hits at one time. And even though the Justice Department beefs up the staff, adds staff, they can't add enough to handle each one of these as they come in. This time, though, it has even another wrinkle in that a lot of the folks at the Department of Justice that started doing this about the time that I did, well, they did like I did. They've retired, and they've had to hire a whole new crew. They've got a lot of new staff that has been through training but has never been through redistricting. They've got a set of rules they've been handed that are going to be very rigid. You're going to get calls that to you think, oh my gosh, what planet is this guy living on? But to them, it's an important question, and they don't have the wide experience to be able to kind of, and so they're going to call and ask you, and answer them as thoroughly as that you can. Because what happens is they have 60 days to review your plan. At some point, if they think they need more information and they send a formal request, they get a second 60 days that does not start until they receive that information. So it's something that's real esoteric and kind of hard for you to come by and get up there, and it takes you, you get the letter, the official letter or whatever, and you start getting it together, and it takes you 14 days, but they've got 60 days plus 14 days plus another 60 days. And right now that just cuts us out of the game as far as the fall elections for councilmen.
Are you going to talk about that scenario later? Susan, are you going to address that later in the program? Guess what?
About what happens to you. Yeah, let's wait till we get toward the end, and it flows better when we get along. So this becomes a major part of the process. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what you can do to enhance your chances as we get through the, but I want you to know that you've got to build this into your thinking and know that it's a problem. Okay. Now, as far as the redistricting stands, I'm going to start with step one. The first thing that you need is that you need the 2000 census numbers of your existing plan. And I call this a one-person, one-vote report. So that you take those plans and you put the new numbers and get these totals.
Lemon, we're in the process of trying to get an appointment, but as a practical matter, do you think there's a chance of getting just the 2010 numbers superimposed on your old district map before you go up there, so that you'll at least have a starting point? You can talk to your elected officials. And
you mean getting the office to send those to you?
Yeah.
You know, all you can do is request it. I don't have an answer for you.
I know y'all used to do that.
I know, but I can't answer for the new crew.
Okay.
Okay, this takes some time over this now. This is the stat sheet that basically is the one the state has used for the last 2 or 3 decades. I mean, in fact, it's pretty much what we've used since the 1971 redistricting. It may have been modified somewhat because of additional information from the census over the years, but this is what it looks like. Up here, you know, this is self-explanatory, but let's talk about this. Now, in some of the in the reports that I do, the state doesn't pull out that one, just your city. But if you're doing it kind of by hand, and you can have some options, this could be LaGrange, the total population, and then the total black population, and percent black, which is a percent of this number. This is something that is going to be new to you. You saw it last year, but it was just called something else. This is all or part black. Let me give you a little history on this one. Prior to the 2000 census, the Census Bureau, before any census, tests every question. They get feedback about the last census, and that's already started for the next census right now as we sit here. When they tested the race question, and they did it among the minority groups, the prime thing that came back to them is that they didn't like being forced to answer a single race. And I think the example that the Bureau uses the most is a mother that was in the audience, and she said, "My children are of mixed race." And she said, "I resent being force to force them into one race or the other and deny their full heritage. I want to be able to answer more than one. Well, she wasn't the only one saying that, and it struck the note with the Census Bureau. So they, and race is self-determined anyway. When you answer that on the census form, you decide what you are. So they decided they would change and let people answer however many they wanted to, whatever they thought was applicable to their circumstances. Well, some in the African American community, NAACP and whatever, thought, well, yes, we can see that, but we're also really worried about what that does to our numbers for redistricting. So for the 2000 census, I call this, and you'll see this on any stat sheet that you have from back there, I call this black combo, black in combination with another race. So I gave black, and then I had black in combination. Over this 10-year period, with that being a new category, the thing that has fallen out that most of us started calling it was all or part black. So that's what that is. You also, as you look at stat sheets with your council, some folks are starting to ask, well, where are the whites? This stat sheet is designed for Section 5 submission. It's the information that the Justice Department needs for preclearance. So basically, if you needed that, for most of us, you take this population and you subtract this, and you have white. And that, it also includes the Asians and whatever. But for most of us, there's not that many in our population. So there are in some areas. If you're in Gwinnett, some areas that becomes very important. We might have to pull out separate numbers, but that's what that is. So you've got all apart, and then you've got that percentage that's of the population. So this percentage is this number, what percentage this number is of the total. Hispanic origin. For some of you, this is just going to be informational purposes only, just to give you another little piece of description about your community. There are some communities in Georgia that it's become very important. If you're in Gainesville, you pay attention to that. If you're in Dalton and some of the other ones, you pay attention. Not so much for us. For the most part, this is not a protected voting minority. For most of us that have some kind of concentration, most of those folks are not citizens yet, and so therefore they can't vote. So this is a Voting Rights Act, so they're not protected so much. Now that doesn't mean that that number is not important, that it may not become an issue for some people about how they style their ballots as far as ballots in 2 languages or this, that, and the other. But for the most part, for most of you, this is going to be informational. Now, that is not a separate category by itself of race. The race are white, black, Asian. Latinos can be black or white. Most of the ones that come from the islands are going to answer black. A lot of those that come from Central and South America are going to give white. So the Hispanic is not a race. It can be different things. It's just it's a ethnicity question. So that's there for informational purposes. And one of the things is that 10 years ago, the Latino community worked so hard with us on the census to get their people counted. This was one way to kind of show their numbers of what that effort did for us. It gave us a 13th congressman, to be honest with you. Without those folks' cooperation, we would not have gotten that 10 years ago. So that's what that is. Now, the second line is 18-plus population or voter age population. So those are the ones out of the total. So out of this 23,643, 17,230 are voting age. And then there's the rest of the numbers going across.
Linda, what do you think the percentage, what would be the percentage at which that Hispanic population would become effective for a voting analysis?
I think the question is, when does that become, is the voting population, when are enough of them citizens that are registering to vote that they become a sizable population and that are concentrated enough in one place that it becomes, feasible to look at what they are. Look at these numbers. I mean, they're scattered all the way down the list, and that's what I'm seeing so far in the stat sheets I've done. Every once in a while you'll see one that's a little heavier by several points than the others, but for the most part I'm finding them scattered. The best thing, I guess, to track that would be to work with the election offices in the counties and see how many Latinos they have registered, because they're tracking it on the race characteristics that they maintain. So if they know it on the registration form, and thank goodness most of the Latinos moved in after we had added that to the voter registration form. You know, for several years, for a couple of decades, we didn't have that on our voter registration card, and we kept getting asked for it. And so finally, they restructured the voter registration card and added that. So I think that would be your best way to track as to when it need to be of concern, would be through the voter registration numbers. Okay, now, so those numbers. Now, let's go to this. This is kind of the piece de resistance. This district, here's your population. Here's how much it varies from this ideal district size of 3,940. So this district was only short 80 people. In this particular one, because the ideal district size is so small, 79 people seems pretty insignificant, except in this instance it's a minus 2%. You've got the next one down, though. It's a minus 24.82%, with the largest one being down here, which is a plus 30.53%. Okay. This is a good test because I always look to see when the stat sheet, when I print that number matches what I filled in up there. And if not, you got to go back and find out where you left some folks. Thank goodness my software will look for left out geography if it's embedded somewhere, but that makes it a little easier. Okay, these numbers down here, oh, some of them, you know, hardly ever get looked at. But this population range, this tells you how much of the population is in the district that's the shortest, which was the 2962, to the largest, which was the 5147. So that's just the real numbers. The absolute deviation range is just a number. So the biggest one was a minus 978 people, and the largest one was 1,207. The overall range of those two added is 2,185. These next two numbers, though, is what you really focus on. If you want to do a quick look at a stat sheet and see whether you have problems, you look at the percent deviation range, which is a minus 24, almost 25%, to almost a plus 31%. Remember the plus or minus 5, obviously this one's not getting it. And then you have an overall deviation of over 55%, which is a long ways from that 10%. So that's what you're looking at. Yes, ma'am.
So Lenny, you're building this data sheet, or the city attorney would be building this data sheet. I mean, where is this information? We built this, it comes from somewhere.
Okay, there's a couple different ways. It's very hard for you to just get the raw data from the Census Bureau in a map and do this yourself anymore. If you were a little small town that had maybe 30 or 40 census blocks in there, it might be possible and you could do it. Most of us aren't like that anymore. It's a little bit bigger and more complicated, and there's too many, like the race cells, when I show you how many, there's like 64 different combinations or something. That becomes very, very difficult. In the last couple of decades, where you've gotten this information most often has been at the reapportionment office at the state capitol. Some cities have had GIS technology for quite a while, and they've been able to do some things for themselves at this point. So you've seen some things from that. I wasn't going to get involved in this at all this time, because once I walked out of there February 1st, 2005, I thought I was through with redistricting. But because of Drew Whalen and Susan, I've been in a few cities that I'm the only one that ever did a redistricting. They had called me starting in December. And so after giving some thought, I thought, well, you know, I could do some, particularly the cities, because it's in a period of time where they're kind of in this limbo land. So I'm doing a lot of cities. I'm willing to help as many of you as I have time for. So, I mean, we can talk about that. But and I think we're trying to get together, and Becky's going to get out some information about where you can get the Census Bureau. But depending on what your city is, you know, it could be harder or whatever. I think that the city attorney shouldn't have to do it. I think if anybody in the city was going to do something like this by hand and figure it out, it ought to be somebody in the planning department, or to sit down and do all that kind of nitty-gritty work. But
So the reapportionment office at the state capitol will be the place you'd start?
I would call them first and see, will they do your one person one vote report for you.
Okay.
And, you know, I don't know how fast they're going to be able to work. Somebody's told me that they called and they can't get an appointment till the 1st of June. Some folks have, you know, so you need to at least check with them and see what they tell you, and then go from there what the answer is. Okay, where were we? Okay, so then once you have this and you see that you have a problem, step 2 is to cure the problem, cure the inequalities of the population. Now, primarily you've got to meet the 2 legal requirements, 1 person, 1 vote, the Voting Rights Act. But in doing that, you can also take into consideration the cores of the existing districts, trying to maintain those. Everybody's kind of used to that. The constituencies know who to call, etc. Communities, what I said, trying not to split a subdivision or a neighborhood if it should stay together, if it makes sense to stay together. And you have to try to maintain your incumbents in so far as that you can't shorten somebody's term. So let's say that no matter how you draw a plan, there's 2 incumbents, live side by side or so close together that you can't separate them. Well, if you have staggered terms, just say a little prayer that one of them's up for election this time, and that he just doesn't get to run again, and that the person that's left will run 2 years from now or something. But because you cannot shorten somebody's term.
Another question. I understand the need to protect incumbents.
It's not a legal requirement. It's a political requirement. You've got to get the plan passed through the council. So the more incumbents that you make, Speaker Murphy taught me, count your noses before you call the vote. Well, the more incumbents that you make unhappy, and those are the folks that have to vote the plan, then you're not going to get a plan passed if we don't. But it's not a legal requirement, particularly if you can explain why it wasn't possible. But you could lose 1 vote and still win. If you lose a couple of votes, then maybe not. So it's more of a political consideration, a practical political consideration than anything.
But the legal consideration would be, for example, you can't shift the district so that this council member is no longer in that district moving forward, right? So that would remove, he no longer resides in the district he's representing. So that you can't do that, I would assume. Is that right? Is that what your last bullet point really goes to?
Well, mainly I'm saying that you cannot draw the plan in such a way that if you have 2 incumbents that neither one of them run for 2 years, and you'd have to, I don't know, I think, and I have to do some research because it's been a while since I thought about that. I think we used to do some language where we let somebody serve out the rest of the term and whatever, but we got around it. But you've got to do something that accommodates all those incumbents and that you don't shorten somebody's term. And there's some different ways of doing that. And some of them was with some language within the bill that they came up with that would allow somebody to finish and then the next one run or whatever. But you've got to figure out a way to accommodate that.
So in the city, we would need to change language in our charter if it's to reflect that. I know in Atlanta.
Oh, you mean like if we had a situation just like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? And Susan and I need to do some research on that specifically. But I know you can't shorten somebody's term, so we've got to find a way to accommodate that and let them finish that term somehow. Now, I will tell you, there's the vast majority of plans that I've drawn, I've been able to keep incumbents separate. It's a rare occasion that you come up with this problem.
I had a question about, sort of along those lines. If you're doing a plan and your midterm, so how does that affect the current term? You draw a plan now that changes the configuration
For the next election, for the next regular scheduled election.
It's for the next election, so the representation currently would just stay as it is.
And it comes in effect the next term.
But for candidates, you would have to consider any candidates for their residency with the new plan.
Yes. Once that new election cycle starts, the new plan kicks in, and that is the plan, and qualifying is based on that, etc.
but representation remains the same until that term ends.
Yes. Yeah, I know. It's
But I remember, I think you're right, there's the standard language that we've always used in a plan that establishes that those effective dates become later.
and Sewell Brumby was like an expert at coming up with that language, and so we could get with him, et cetera, and come up with something that we needed to. But there's language that we've always used in there, but we don't need it very often, okay? Every once in a while we've had to, and sometimes, you know, it's come up where we really had to do some drastic changes, et cetera. But for the most part, you're not going to run across this problem. The census data and all gives you enough flexibility that usually there's a way to figure it out. But for those instances which not, then we're going to have to. Okay, now this is when I said, you know, cure the problem. So this is that plan with the numbers fixed. District 1 was that one that was minus 2.01%. It was within the 2% range. It didn't seem to be any sense because, you know, and when I drew plans, I always said plan 1, I usually tried before, if you had an appointment next week, I tried to sit down this week, get your numbers for based on the 2010, and I drew what I call the first working plan, where I sit down where I try to keep incomes apart, but without knowing personalities or anything else. I did what I call minimum change that cured the problems, and that's where we usually started from. And that's what this plan I did. I just took something and then I fixed it. Well, this one didn't need fixing, so it was on the edge. It didn't. I could leave it. So that district is the same as it was on the existing plan. These other ones all had to be shifted. Now, I should have had something side by side, but you've got these two that were heavy. This one has always been about that number. In fact, this one probably came up a percentage point. This one went down. It's less than it was under the benchmark plan. But it was in an area where things had to shift because of the shifts in population. These other two districts were landlocked, and it had to take from the district that was over. But this is also the district that we know it didn't exist 10 years ago, and it's because of the shifts of population and the annexation and what is being built in there. So we knew, in this case, that there's a big apartment complex, and only phase 1 is being lived in right now. Phase 2 is almost being completed, and the local authorities know that that is probably going to be primarily minority population. So his district is going to immediately start coming back up again. But again, the next rules is that the 61%, the 57% voter age population in this district should hold the day. We shouldn't have problems with that. Okay. Going down to here, then see how these numbers have come down, or minus 2.34 to plus 3.22, and overall 5.5%. So well within the ranges. This one I put in just for you to have some kind of idea of, and it's not very clear, and I apologize, but I will talk a little bit about what is on there. If you're working map with GIS, then you've got all the census data and everything available to you. The color is the new districts as they got drawn. These heavy black lines, I can overlay your existing lines. So I constantly, as I'm working the plan, I see where I'm making the changes. When I make the presentation, or when you take that plan back home to councilman or explain it, you can show what they lost and what they gained. And then here it's not very clear, but here's a red star where in this particular area I've marked the incumbent. But more importantly, what you're seeing here, see those little numbers? This one, for example, that is a census block. The top number is the total population that's in that census block, and the bottom number is the percent all apart black. So as I start having to shift population, trying to equalize the population, but also maintain those minority percentages, that's a key piece of information. So I know before I shift if I'm going to get the kind of numbers I need to cure that particular district. So those are tools that are there. Here is your changing. For District 1, for example, here's where I'm starting from. I'm going to move a block that has 64 people in it. So I'm going to be up to here. This is going to be the new deviation and the percent deviation. So, and then over here it's showing me what I took away and the fact that it had the other effect of what it went down to. So I'm kind of seeing what I'm changing, the effect on both districts I'm having as I'm moving. Very, very seldom anymore do you draw a plan from just scratch where you have the city white and you start going block by block. For the most part, you're going to have an existing plan that you're just shifting to cure the problems. Every once in a while, if you know, there are some, I guess, instances where you would start from scratch, but not very often anymore. And I think, for the most part, the municipal code says that you should make minimal changes just to cure the problems. But you know, minimal changes is one of those things that's in the eye of the beholder. Okay, step 3 is the ordinance itself. Once a plan has been adopted by the council, what do? You've got to have an ordinance for them to actually look at and to put before them and to pass. First decision you're going to have to make is how do you describe these districts within that ordinance? And you've got 2 choices. You can do a meets and bounds description, which 25, 30 years ago was kind of the standard. And only the legislative council would allow us to do that. The city or county attorneys had to do that, where you start at a point on the city limits and you describe by street, going southerly, easterly, or whatever, until you take that district where it touches the city limits again. There's lots of good reasons for doing that. Anybody could pick up the ordinance after the fact and see where the districts are. If they had a city chamber of commerce map or one from the bank and figure out the districts, and if they didn't want anybody to know they were considered running, they didn't even have to tell anybody they were looking. But it's very laborious, and I always double check them. I can't tell you how many I found mistakes in. So it was kind of a partnership between me and the city attorney about correcting these things and checking, because it's very tedious and it's very easy. As you're looking at it, you're thinking left, right instead of east, west, and those type of things. The other option is a census block description, and that's the only thing that the legislature has used since the 70s to do it. And more in the last couple of rounds, that's basically what the local governments have gone to. And that's where each district is described in terms of census block and whatever, census tracts and blocks. That is very serviceable because it's fast, it's easy to do, it's easy to then double check, etc. John Q. or whatever can't pick up a copy of the ordinance and figure it out. You know, you'd have to go to the trouble to get a census map with the census geography designations on there or whatever. But it's the fastest and the safest, and if you're under time squeeze, it's probably preferable. In that ordinance, there's a couple other things you might want to consider. First being language that the ordinance will not take effect unless it's pre-cleared by the first day of qualifying. And to me, I kind of think this is pretty important. First of all, it just clears away any indecision, any confusion as to what you're going to hold the election on. We had instances where we'd get close and, 58 days and it was the first day of qualifying, or we're right there and they kind of thought it would probably be cleared and give it a couple more days. Well, we were in the middle of qualifying under a new map that had not been pre-cleared. And then if they come back with those questions, you're in a pickle. So if you just make it clear, that way the election people know what they have to go forward on, because you don't know how much work it is for them to implement one of these in a short period of time and get it right. And most of the counties do not have GIS capability to help them. They do this by hand. So that's the first one. The second one, you may want to consider some language in there that says that if there's any piece of the city that didn't get described by a census block, let's say that you had a late annexation or something and didn't get picked up, or something just got left out, well, that piece of geography goes with the district that it's contiguous to. Or if it touches 2 different districts, then it goes with the district that has the least population. And this is just one of those cover your fanny sections. Yes, sir.
What if we've annexed a large tract since the census day, but it's already in effect? Will that show up on the map we'll be using when we're doing our?
Not unless you tell whoever's drawing the map and give them a map so they can, it'll have to be kind of hand edited on there, but you also need to give them the population. So at the time that it was annexed, since it's been annexed since January the 1st, 2010, was it empty land? If not, how many housing units do you have in it? In the case of the housing units, what the best thing to do is that in the census data for your city, they'll tell you how many total housing units you had and how many occupied housing units you had. Take your city total and divide it by the occupied housing unit count, and you're going to have the average number per housing unit. So if you know that you've got X number of parcels out there with residents on there that are occupied, sometimes you have, right now, if I drive to McDonough, I go through 2 or 3 subdivisions that are brand new. They're still sitting empty because they got just finished as a crunch hit, and there's nobody there. You can't anticipate what might move in there in the next 10 years. It's what's on the ground right now. But you're going to have to come up with some kind of number of occupied and then apply that. Now, you may or may not know racial characteristics, depending on how large a population it is. So in those instances, if I do that in the census block and take those in of the block they were in, let's say that I see that amounted to 30% of that block population, then I make the assumption, good or bad, that the population is evenly distributed. So I take 30% of the voter age population for that block, 30% of the black, 30% of the olive black, 30% of the Hispanic, and fill in those numbers. Now, the question will come up, so since we're talking about hand splits or estimates and whatever, let's talk about the question that comes up about, can you split a census block? I hate to have to do that. Sometimes you just can't get around it. You're going to have, particularly the smaller the city, the smaller the ideal, you have census blocks that have a public housing complex in there, a whole new subdivision or something, that all of a sudden that block is 1,500 people. And there, where do you put that and you still maintain your population balance? You might have, part of the problem is the Census Bureau, what they have to use for block boundaries, and they have to use the outside visible, whatever they can connect all the way around. It's not a nice square city block as we think about it. It could be several shapes. It's going to go around from this road to this road, over to the highway, down the creek, down this railroad, back to this little road, and then back up to the main road. In that, you have this road, and you have subdivisions here and subdivisions here, and a big empty space down the middle. Hopefully, that big empty space down the middle is something we can use, and it's something visible that we can describe. And then we do the same thing, is that we get the housing unit count on one side of it and do as I explained. And it's because, or maybe it's because you have subdivisions here and subdivisions here because there's a creek, and that's a watershed area, and so those houses back up to that water, and there's nothing else is going to be built there. You've got that, but we have to have a way to describe that split to do that. It's very tedious, and you could probably do one and not destroy the integrity of the numbers too much. But don't try to do it 2 and 3 and 4 times to make it work. Then you're really out on the limb. So if there's only one, you've got a block, and for some kind of a reason, 2 incumbents live in the same census block, one in this subdivision and one on the other road, and you've got something like that, or if you've got numbers problems or whatever. But if you're going to do it in a plan, probably you only do it once, because the more you do it, those numbers that you got from the census kind of go out the window. And remember what we said, the PL94 data is the only game in town. The exception would be for you've had annexations, and you've got to come up with that. And some of, in 2000, when we were growing so fast, by the time we got the census, we had lots of annexations that we had to take into consideration. The growth has kind of slowed down, so you're not seeing quite as many of those this go around.
Linda, are the census blocks, are they roughly the same in size? I mean, how do they determine what, or is there no?
The rule should be, and I think in 1980, when I convinced the leadership of the legislature to purchase block data for the whole state so we had some flexibility, they explained to me that it was the smallest areas that you can bound on all sides by a visible ground feature, with the exception of a city limit or a county line or something like that. When we got it, it wasn't always quite the case. There had been some kind of tributary that could have divided on, or unimproved road or a pipeline that would have been just perfect for me to use or something like that. But for the most part, the rule is it's by visible boundary. So it could have several sides. It's not going to be that nice. Okay, because of that, you can have some blocks that have 0 people. You can have a whole lot of blocks in a subdivision that are pretty much the same, you know, whatever. And then you're going to get some of these blocks because of the shape of the census block that have 700, 800, 1,800 or something in there. And then it becomes really a big problem.
Here's another hard question. Is every census block going to be wholly within a city or wholly outside of the city, or are there going to be some that are?
Bless them, they did make the decision to make every block totally within the city. That some earlier census, that was not always the case. We had some split blocks, but they did give us the data on either side of the split. But now, census blocks are wholly contained within the jurisdiction. Okay, submission to the Department of Justice is back to where we were talking about a little earlier. I cannot emphasize enough, and in the packet that you got that was put together for you, there is the new U.S. DOJ, Department of Justice guidance that came out April the 15th. It's a lot more readable, it's a lot friendlier, etc. Content-wise, I didn't see a whole lot of changes, but you know, you need to take some time to go over it. Be sure that everything they ask for is mandatory, and then I think there's one, I forgot the title they use, whether it's additional information or supplementary information. Go through that, and I'm telling you, you want to not give them a reason to come back to you for the second 60 days. So it has to be as complete as possible. We're going to go through some things that I think need to be in there, and then I'm going to also talk about some things that are just kind of community kinds of information that you need to put in there that are not strictly related to the redistricting plan. They do not have easy capabilities for reproducing the maps that you sent up there, particularly of your existing plan. So I'm telling you, I don't know forgot what the new guidance says, but I'm telling you to send 2 copies of the benchmark plan, a copy of the 2000 census numbers for that benchmark plan, a copy of the 2010 census data for that benchmark plan. Okay, so they've got all of that data. Send a copy of the preclearance letter for the plan that's now in effect. That has, or you have to give them some kind of number or something, but you can look at that, but be sure that you refer to that so that they have it. Then you want a copy of your new ordinance, 2 copies of the new redistricting plan, and the stat sheet for the redistricting plan. So those are the bare minimum for just the plan itself. Now,
Can you go back to that slide? Chattahoochee Hills is a new city, and from what I understand, there is no 2000 census data that we can use. That it was kind of guesstimated how many people live in that area of South Fulton County.
right, it was one of those, yeah.
Right, and we have severe deviation between the various council districts. So we're really
Send what the redistricting office gave you when that legislation went through, because the rule is they couldn't have drafted the legislation. They had to have put something in there. That's why they had to come up with some kind of numbers. Send that as a beginning point. What's really going to be more helpful to them is the 2010 numbers. But go ahead and send what went with the legislation. There was a map and some kind of a stat sheet that went with that when Chattahoochee Hills was formed.
right, and then one on the eve of creating the city, Palmetto annexed a huge tract of land right in the middle of what is now Chattahoochee Hills and pulled it out. Again, messed up all the numbers. So it's going to be complicated.
But that was after the, well, go with what you had first, because that's all you've got. But then the 2010 is what's going to be important, and then what you do afterwards. Okay.
Is this what's new?
Yes.
This reg, this CFR, is that new stuff?
You have the old CFR stuff and the new, because the new stuff just has the new information. They didn't reprint all of it. They just did new stuff, so you have to have both of them and read them together.
Isn't that nice?
Isn't that nice? And you have a cover letter. I did a draft cover letter based on the new materials. And that has some information that you'll find helpful responding to things like under what authority are you doing home rule redistricting? When did the state pre-clear that? I already got that from the AG's office and put it in the letter for you. But the rest of it you're going to have to sort of fill out yourself. And they are encouraging you this time, to do the electronic filing, if at all possible. It's on the letter, is the cover letter in your materials is the website for electronic filing, which is now available.
How long has that been available?
A long time, actually. We electronically submitted all the state stuff in 2001.
But apparently they've worked out some bugs.
Yeah.
Dennis Dunn at the AG's office, I've been communicating with him, and he's been very helpful with this. And he said to really use that if you can. Then we suggest you send a backup copy, hard copy as well. The good thing about using the electronic is it gets there immediately. And you can attach your maps electronically and things like that. But if you go through the written document, it will help you answer these questions and make sure that you have everything compiled before you sit down to try to start entering your data. Okay?
So that was a good thing about the electronic, because that kind of goes with this. Because of electronic filing, and she's right, it's Drew Whalen told me that's all he uses now, and it's worked really well for him, but we used it for, there were some things we had to send by hand 10 years ago, but we could send the bulk up there and get the process started. And I think now they've made it where it's easier to do all of it. One of the things you need then, once everything's done, and if possible, and it depends on what kind of method, who does the plan for you, what kind of software and whatever, is to do a database file, but is what I call a block equivalency file, which takes each of the census blocks in your jurisdiction and says block 101, District 2, block 102, District 2, block 103, District 4. So it's a database file because the Department of Justice has their own redistricting software, so they can pull your plan in easily, and they do their own analysis. So you can do that. You can take your maps, small maps, and attach them as PDFs. You can take the stat sheet and attach it as a PDF. Obviously, you can send your letter as a Word or PDF document or whatever. So you can, and they spend some time, I think, in this new CFR talking about the electronic submission, but it's a really good way to, it makes it easier on you, I think. I think it's much easier on you. There again, also they often request election data, so I'm not sure whether you, unless they ask for it in there, I think that's something you wouldn't know whether they're going to look at it or not. An instance that I could think would be helpful is that one of the jurisdictions I've been working with has had a big shift of population. It's changing, and African Americans have moved in from some other counties and filling in, and so they've got a district that didn't exist before, basically. And then African American was elected last time, but by only 70 votes. Well, they're going to have to do some shifting, and that election returns for that may become very important in that consideration, depending on what they're able to do with that district.
I think they want election data for, if any elections have been held since you last submitted anything.
Yeah, so you just send the returns.
You routinely include it. I mean,
yeah, well, if it's mentioned in there, folks, I cannot overemphasize. Put more things, err on the side of caution, and put as much information in these things as possible. Along with that, they ask for community contacts and minority community contacts. They may have some of their own, but you want to put those down. You want to mark which incumbents might be minority members so that they can say that they were part of the process and what they thought about it. If you've got some other active leadership that comes to city council meetings that participates, puts their name and phone number in there. If there were articles in the newspaper about the redistricting, where the local paper covered the council meeting, have somebody clipping those articles and attach that in your hard copy. You can't obviously send that electronically, but that can be in this backup folder that you send the next day. You want to put that information in there. If there was a public hearing and minutes were kept, you want to put that information in there. I think there's something in there about the process, etc. So, go through that. You want to fill all of that in. Okay, the place that you ask within the letter for expedited action, and you tell them why, and you tell them that we have qualifying the first day, August the 29th. A new thing, and this is something Drew Whalen brought back to me about 10 days ago. He was in D.C. at a seminar, and one of the folks that was there with him is the new assistant chief of the voting section. And Mr. Berman told him, put it on the outside of the envelope too. Put it in there that says expedited action and put the date of the qualifying on there. When they get this envelope, whatever, it goes through some various steps before it gets to the person that's going to review it. I mean, the first thing they do is they test it for bombs and stuff, I think. But they're very careful. But anyway, put it on the outside of the envelope as well as on the letter requesting it. Okay, what happens if we don't get all this done? Well, if they're badly malapportioned, you can, a plaintiff might ask the federal judge to enjoin the elections until you can come up with a new plan. Once it gets in the federal judge's hand, you know.
The incumbents will be fine with that.
Well, in some respects, you're exactly right, except that the judge may decide to draw his own plan, and they may not like that one. If you have a plan that you've already done and you tried your best and it's sitting at justice waiting for pre-clearance, they may just take that plan. They may take that plan and make a couple of changes just so they can say it's a court-drawn plan or something. But it could very well, depending on the timing, it could change qualifying the election time or whatever. You know, it's kind of hard to tell. Once it gets into the federal judge's hands, it's kind of hard to, you're not in charge anymore. If the election, if you go ahead and you get the election held under this one that's badly malapportioned, somebody that just didn't like the outcome could then challenge it and say it's violation of 14th Amendment, equal protection, etc. They look at those numbers, it was 55% or whatever, they were pretty good. That's all the judge has to say. He's going to set that election aside, get a new plan drawn, or he'll set aside until the legislature can act or whatever, and then you're going to have to pay to hold a new election. Or no one may care. You know, there may, John Q down there may just not even be aware of this, have any stake in the game, etc., and you hold the election and nobody says anything, and then you get your redistricting done before the 2013 election. Okay. Oh, I didn't know that was on there. That was one of those things you guys added. Are there any questions? Remember, you can't get out of the room without one. Yes, sir.
What about prison?
That's a good question. Thank you. Your local jail, you're probably kind of stuck with that. That's your local folks probably waiting for trial or whatever. But if you've got a state prison or a federal prison or something that's in your area, what I started doing 10 years ago, and now all the new stuff that's coming out that I've seen from other states, more and more are doing this. I took it out of the population before I ever figured the ideal district size, because most of those prisons in some of the smaller towns had so many people in there, they'd be a district and a half by themselves and nobody to run. I mean, it was just ludicrous. And it's easy to justify why we do that. The DOJ didn't object to one of them. Once, you know, we explained that we pulled that out. It was state prisoners. They were not, you know, they weren't able to vote. So I've taken those out and then refigured it and worked around them, because usually the numbers are so big in a smaller town that you can't really. Now, that is not the case though with colleges, private schools, etc. Those you have to keep in the count. Prisons is about the only one I know that I would tell you to do that with. Okay, anything else? Yes, sir?
And I've had a conversation with your clients about this. What do you think a good policy would be about how many plans to take back to your local government in consideration?
I will tell you that if we come up with a good working plan that solves all the, keeps it incumbent in each district, it keeps the numbers where they need to be, and they'll take it, that would be the one to go with. If once you present that to the council, if there's some questions or comments and somebody feels really strongly about that, then you have Plan 1R, one revised, and you make those changes as response to those concerns. every plan that's considered, you have to submit part of the submission process. So if you looked at 5 plans, you've got to have all of those 5 plans and all the material that goes with them to submit to justice, and you have to tell why you didn't take each one of them. And if there happens to be one that may be a little bit more to their liking than the one you sent, then you may have some problems. So you don't want a lot to have to comparison. If you've got one that the council likes and will pass it, that you feel meets the legal requirements, that would be best. Also, the other downside at this point is that it takes time to come up with each revision, and it slows the process down, and you're against a deadline right now, so you want to minimize the time that it takes. But if they're just totally unhappy, then it's going to be good to take the time to try to fix it.
If you were sitting on opinion on public hearings, recommend them, not, or?
Yes, I think they're a good idea.
What you may want to do, though, is attach those to the city council meeting, not make a separate one because of time. Just
Right.
Advertise publicly on your local radio, whatever, that it's being considered this, and we would love public input and let them come.
Do you need more than one public hearing?
No, I don't. It's up to the jurisdiction. I mean, you could have as many, but I think right now, under what we're dealing with, if you had one with the time frame that was well publicized, I think that would meet the spirit. Susan, what do you think?
I think so too. I just think it's important to show an opportunity for the public to review and comment. That's important to justice, I think.
We're not in time crunch.
Okay, I mean, another way to get around that, or not around it, but a way to make it easier or whatever to maybe also meet that is that depending on your jurisdiction, if you've got a website for your city, is take the PDF and the stats and put it on your website and advertise that it's there, that they can look at, and then give them a space on that they can send you a comment back. Yeah, all this electronics that we have now, I mean, there's some blessings in that as far as being able to do this. And Justice Department looks at the fact that there was some public input like that. Okay, anything else? Yes, sir.
You draw your ordinance, your charter amendment, so that this is going to be the new districts, but if it's not received preclearance by qualifying date, we're going to assume this is okay, but whatever, but it's not okay.
You proceed under your
Correct.
You proceed under the Preclear ordinance.
Okay.
If not precleared, you proceed under your old one.
Qualifying is going to be what we have right now.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And you're running into chances that you may be malapportioned, but it's what you have to go with. Preclearance is a bit of a misnomer. It's preclearance before you can have your election on it, but you have to fully adopt it before justice will look at it.
So you could even, the preclearance could come in the time frame from when qualifying has ended and before the election.
Yes.
So you still have to, you're still be under your current system, not the new Preclear, because you don't have any candidates who maybe not candidates who qualify.
Correct, but and you may hold your election under your current one and then get a challenge because you're malapportioned because you sent all that information into justice showing that you were malapportioned. I mean, and in which case then a judge may order you to hold a new election under your new plan.
No good deed.
Right. Yeah, because you do really have to sort of show why did we change these lines because we were malapportioned.
You have to be pre-cleared to do that.
And you have to be pre-cleared. So it's this dance that you have to go through, right, to get everything done. But you hold your election on the last pre-cleared plan.
What else? Yes, sir.
What if you just left it alone for
This election?
this election? I know someone still can say, hey, you malapportioned. But if you thought you could not get it done.
See, all of this is sort of a gamble. I mean, either choice you make, it's got the pluses and the minuses. And there's going to be a lot of them that are going to have to make that choice simply because they're just not going to be able to do it for lots of reasons. At least maybe if you went into court, you ought to be able to at least say, well, I called the redistricting office at the state and they said I couldn't get into the 1st of July, or we tried this, that, and the other, but there were no open appointments prior to, and that it's so complicated now we can't do this by hand. I mean, at least you have some reasons show that you did make a choice, but you just couldn't get the help to do it. You could build it that way, you know. But you know, a lot of people, the Justice Department doesn't really get upset over one person, one vote, unless it's a case where there's a minority population that, if under the new census, that you could reformulate and make a stronger district or make a district period, then they might get interested. But that's not so severe that one election probably one way or the other would make a difference. It's folks that are trying to find something wrong to challenge it for whatever reason on the outside. If you get a Section 14 equal protection lawsuit, it usually comes from some John Q. citizen that thinks that a change in the lines will be better for some reason. So, I mean, there's going to be a lot of people that don't get to it.
So Linda, Justice drops census block information into their own system and produces, and that's how we could use an independent contractor like you, because we'll still have the raw data. But you're saying we don't have to have a plan crunched by the state computer at the reapportionment office, because Justice does their own.
Well, I mean, you have to present them with a plan with those numbers. I mean,
they're
not going to do a plan for
What
them.
I'm saying is we don't have to have a sanctioned reapportionment office at the Capitol map to send up there.
No.
Okay.
For example, let's see, I'm trying to think, don't hold me to this, but I want to say there are some cities, and I want to say even 10 years ago, the city of Gainesville had some pretty sophisticated GIS and whatever, and it was laborious and whatever, but they actually did draw their own plan and send it in. You know, whatever. I mean, you know, you can do it if you've got the capability and you've got time. Now, I don't think they had an election. I just don't remember the details on this, so I shouldn't wander too far on that. But you can, yeah, you can draw your own plan. That's the beauty, and that's what the cities have. The counties don't. The ability to do a plan on their own and go ahead and submit it to Justice without going through the legislature.
I was referring more to you're doing it on our behalf. I guess the same principle applies.
Yeah. Yeah. There's only me, and I'm by myself, and I've told Susan and whatever, I will help as many of you as that want me to help you as I can, but there's no way that I can do everybody. So I probably, if I'm going to get into this, the rule I've been using is first come, first serve. So I've been doing them as they come in and try to, you know, I will tell you to just, if it's not a really large city and complicated, it takes me about 3 hours just to put your plan in, get the incumbents plotted on there, and just come up with that one person, one vote report. That's the first step, and that's about 3 hours of work.
Can we just see in the room who has actually received word on when your appointment is if you've asked for one for Reapportionment Services? Ask the month.
Next Wednesday.
We haven't heard yet.
Okay. Anybody else? Questions? Susan? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very well.
Thanks so much.